seconds. That's all it took for Jasmine Crockett to detonate the Senate chamber. Under the burning lights of a live national broadcast, she cornered Donald Trump, a 79-year-old president already staggering from humiliating blunders, and drove the knife deeper by exposing the press secretary shielding him. Gasps ripped through the room, security shifted in their seats, and every lens in America zoomed in. Could be so lethal that they left the most defiant man in U.S. politics paralyzed before the nation. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Air light burned like a warning flare at the back of the Senate hearing room. Every major network in America was locked in. Camera lenses glinted like rifle scopes aimed at the witness table. Rows of reporters leaned forward, fingers hovering over keyboards, waiting to carve the next headline from whatever happened in the next few minutes. Trump sat in the center, a fortress of defiance in a navy suit, chin tilted upward as if the world itself had come to take notes from him. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her hands folded on the polished surface, every muscle in her face held in place like tempered steel. Her eyes never left him, not when he glanced toward the cameras, not when his lips curled into that practiced half-smile. She wasn't here to smile, she was here to strike. Monitors mounted along the back wall. A montage rolled for the public record. There was Trump, 2 days earlier, declaring in front of a pack of reporters that he would be in Russia by Friday, not Alaska, as the official schedule read. The clip played twice, then cut to Caroline Leavitt at the White House podium the next morning, smiling to why, insisting, perhaps the president will visit Russia one day. It showed Trump introducing his cabinet during a bill signing, calling the Secretary of Homeland Security Christy Kerr, a retired golfer. The laughter from the press pool in that clip was still audible through the speakers now. The final cut landed like a slap Trump on live TV, mid-sentence, scanning the crowd and asking, "Derek? Where's Derek?" as Representative Derek Van Orden stood directly beside him. The screen faded to black, the chamber fell silent. His gaze didn't flicker. Inside her mind, the images overlapped with another kind of montage. Her father, stopped and questioned outside their home for looking suspicious. Her grandmother's voice telling her, "If you're not at the table, you're on the menu." The faces of voters in her district who told her, "We need someone who doesn't just talk back, we need someone who fights." She felt the burn of those memories in her chest, fueling her resolve like oxygen feeding a flame. Gavel cracked once, echoing through the marble and oak. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, just enough for her voice to carry without a microphone. She could see the faint bead of sweat forming along Trump's temple under the blinding studio lights. He wouldn't admit it, but the room was hotter than it looked. And she intended to turn the heat up further. Pause hang just long enough for the tension to tighten like a wire across the chamber. Then, with a calmness that cut deeper than a shout, she asked, "What happens when the leader of the free world forgets where he is?" The words seemed to freeze in the air for a moment before they landed, sharp and heavy, somewhere between accusation and prophecy. All eyes shifted to Trump. For the first time that morning, he didn't smirk. After Jasmine's question was short-lived. Trump leaned into his mic, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're just another loudmouth from the left," he said, letting the words drip with contempt. A few Republican aides in the back row chuckled under their breath, but the sound was thin, nervous like a match struck in a storm. Jasmine didn't blink. Then lost. She shot back, her voice steady as a blade sliding from its sheath. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even the clicking of reporters' keyboards slowed. Trump's jaw tightened. His fingers tapped once against the table, a small tell that the hit had landed. He would fire back. Caroline Leavitt, posed beside him like a human shield, leaned toward her microphone. "The president is fully in command of every decision he makes." One slip of the tongue. Jasmine turned her gaze to Caroline so fast it was like a camera snap. One slip of the tongue. Her tone was soft, almost curious, which made the words cut deeper. "Miss Leavitt, you're 27 years old. Run a city, a state, or a country. But you've been sent out here to clean up after a man who forgets where he's going. That's not press work, that's babysitting." Gasps cracked through the room like breaking glass. His composure wavered. Her smile twitched at the edges. Trump's eyes narrowed, but Jasmine kept talking, her voice low and deliberate. You've been asked to tell the American people it's fine when the president calls Alaska Russia, when he calls a cabinet secretary by the wrong name, when he can't find a congressman standing right next to him. You think that's loyalty? No, that's surrender. And you're surrendering the truth for the sake of his pride. He shifted in his seat, his hand gripping the mic base. You don't get to talk to her like that. Then answer for yourself, Jasmine cut in, her tone now electric with challenge. Tell America why its leader keeps losing track of reality. Tell the families who depend on stable leadership why they should trust a man who can't remember the names of the people he appointed. The room felt smaller, heavier. Somewhere in the back, a camera operator forgot to breathe. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. The pause stretched just long enough to turn awkwardness into spectacle. Caroline glanced at him, waiting for a cue that didn't come. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, never breaking eye contact, her voice dropping into something quieter, almost intimate, yet impossible to ignore. The question isn't whether you can protect him from embarrassment. It is whether you can protect this country from him. The sentence hit the chamber like a closing door, sharp, final, and inescapable. The air in the chamber had shifted. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that hummed, the kind that lives between lightning and thunder. Reporters bent low over their notepads, pens scratching furiously, eyes darting between Jasmine and Trump like they were tracking to prizefighters in the final round. Span fee. The live chat box pulsed with a flood of comments. She's destroying him. Watch his hands, he's rattled. This is history unfolding. Phones across the gallery were raised like a field of periscopes, recording every twitch, every breath. Jasmine didn't move, didn't fidget. Her stillness was deliberate, a silent dare for Trump to fill the space. Gaze with a smirk that seemed carved into place, but the white of his knuckles betrayed the strain, fingers gripping the edge of the table like it might drift away. Caroline sat rigid beside him, eyes fixed on her notes, but lips pressed so tight they'd turned pale. The gallery felt on the brink of something combustible. The chair's gavel struck the desk, startling even the most seasoned reporters. 5-minute recess, the voice announced. It was nothing unusual in procedure, but in this moment, it felt like cutting a fuse mid-spark. The murmurs began instantly, swelling into a low roar as aides scrambled in and out of the chamber. Police officers stepped between the witness table and the press row, not because it was necessary, but because the tension had turned physical, like static before a storm. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her eyes following Trump as he stood and conferred with Caroline, their heads bent close, the faint hiss of whispered strategy lost under the rustle of shuffling papers. That's something she said, but it was too quick, too sharp, the laugh of a man using nose to hide thought. Across the aisle, a Democratic aide handed Jasmine a folded note. She opened it just enough to read, "Socials are blowing up. Keep him in the corner." She tucked it into her folder without a change in expression. Outside the chamber doors, cameras were already waiting. Inside, the spectators lingered, unwilling to give up their seats even for a bathroom break. It hadn't cooled anything, it had only made the air heavier, thicker, like a room where everyone had agreed to hold their breath at the same time. A few eyes kept flicking to the clock mounted above the chamber floor. 5 minutes was almost up. And landed back on the table with a soft thud. Jasmine straightened in her chair, the faintest arch of an eyebrow the only sign she'd been watching him the whole time. The chair's gavel would fall again any second. And when it did, the sound wouldn't just mark the resumption of a hearing, it would be the opening bell to a fight that could end one career, or both. It hadn't even fallen yet when Jasmine's mind flickered, unbidden, to a different kind of room, smaller, dimmer, the air heavy with the smell of rain on cracked pavement. She was 9 years old, standing on the curb outside their apartment complex, her backpack digging into her shoulders, when she saw the red and blue lights wash over her father's face. Others had pulled up beside his old Buick, hands resting on their belts, voices carrying that mix of false calm and cold suspicion. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." No explanation, no probable cause. Just the quiet violence of being presumed guilty for existing in the wrong skin, in the wrong zip code. Complied because every black man she knew understood that surviving the moment was more important than winning it. She remembered the way his eyes found hers across the hood of the car, steady but burning with a shame that wasn't his to carry. That look didn't just etch itself into her memory, It welded itself to her spine. One officer thumbed the edge of his holster while the other rifled through the car, and she understood before she even understood politics that power could be abused simply because it existed. Their neighborhood was a chorus of slamming doors, raised voices, and the hum of the streetlight that buzzed over the basketball court where boys her age dreamed of NBA contracts instead of college degrees. The corner store kept aspirin behind the counter, not because it was expensive, but because theft was expected. At 13, she knew which houses had fathers at home and which ones didn't, not because anyone told her, but because absence is loud when it becomes normal. Worked double shifts at the diner off Main Street, the kind of place where regulars called her sweetheart and management called her replaceable. Dinner was often eaten to the soundtrack of local news segments about crime upticks that never mentioned poverty, underfunded schools, or shuttered factories. She didn't just watch those stories, she studied them, filing away every omission, every skewed statistic, every face in a suit pretending to understand a life they'd never lived. While she was helping her grandmother fold laundry, the old woman said, "You've got a mouth on you, girl. Use it for something that matters." Jasmine didn't know then that she would. But she knew one thing. She would never stand on a curb again, powerless to stop the injustice playing out in front of her. She would find a way to put herself at the table where decisions were made even if the door wasn't dealt for her to walk through. Sitting across from Donald Trump in the blistering lights of the Senate chamber, she felt that same fire, that same steel in her bones. She wasn't just here to ask questions, she was here to repay a debt to the little girl who watched her father's dignity be questioned for no reason at all. And in the fight ahead, those childhood scars might just be the sharpest weapon she carried. It had been a knife fight she hadn't expected to win, but couldn't afford to lose. She was the first in her family to even set foot inside those marble lecture halls, walking past classmates in tailored blazers and $1,000 watches, each one speaking the language of legacy like it was their birthright. Jasmine spoke the language of survival, late nights working in a diner to pay rent, studying under the flicker of a kitchen light while the rest of the city slept. Clearly that in a place built for privilege, the only way to be heard was to outthink and outlast everyone in the room. Her first big case came sooner than anyone thought possible. Crockett v. State Board of Elections. A rural county had quietly purged hundreds of voters from registration rolls, mostly poor, mostly black, mostly invisible to anyone who didn't live there. Landed on her desk at a small civil rights firm because no one else wanted to touch it. The payout was small, the odds worse, but Jasmine didn't measure cases by odds. She measured them by the cost of silence. Into the courtroom for the first hearing, she faced Judge Harold Bedna, a conservative appointee known for slicing young attorneys apart in open court. Denton peered down over his glasses, lips twitching with a smirk that said, "You're out of your depth." His opening volley was a casual dismissal. "Counselor, you'll forgive me if I ask you to keep this brief." Where this is headed, Jasmine didn't blink. "With respect, Your Honor, we don't, and that's exactly why we're here." The words landed with a weight that made the stenographer pause for half a breath before resuming. For 3 days, she dismantled the state's defense piece by piece: registration logs, statistical anomalies, internal memos showing they knew the purge would disproportionately hit minority voters. She didn't raise her voice once. Need to. She let the facts do the cutting. Each exhibit another blade slipped between the armor of the opposition. On the final date, Judge Benton leaned forward, scanning her closing argument like he was searching for a crack. He didn't find one. The ruling came down in her favor, restoring every purged voter to the rolls before the next election. Courthouse. An elderly woman in a faded church hat took Jasmine's hands in hers and said, "I've been voting since '68, and I wasn't about to stop now. Thank you for making sure I didn't have to." That moment lodged itself beside all the others in Jasmine's memory: the curb, the flashing lights, the look on her father's face, and hardened into something immovable. As she sat in the Senate chamber across from Donald Trump, she knew this was the same fight, just on a bigger stage and with higher stakes. The rules hadn't changed, neither had her weapon. And if she could take apart a judge in his own courtroom, she was ready to see if she could do the same to the most powerful man in America. It began with nothing but a borrowed folding table, a stack of handmade flyers, and a determination that kept her moving long after the sun went down. Nights were spent driving from one end of the district to the other, headlights cutting through empty highways, the backseat cluttered with poster boards and paper coffee cups. Church basements, union halls, and neighborhood basketball courts lit only by street lamps, her voice carrying over the hum of cicadas and the rumble of passing trains. Some nights only a dozen people showed up, other nights 100 crammed into a space built for 50, standing shoulder to shoulder, hanging on every word. She talked like a politician, she talked like someone who had been on the receiving end of bad policy. She told stories about the neighbor evicted after a hospital bill, about the kid who couldn't vote because his registration went missing, about her father on the curb under the police spotlight. She didn't promise to fix everything overnight. She promised to fight like hell every day she had the power to. That honesty cut through the cynicism like glass breaking. For weeks, the campaign had grown into something bigger than her. Volunteers worked from dawn to midnight, knocking on doors until their knuckles ached. Retirees baked casseroles for the phone bank crews. Teenagers printed TikTok videos of her speeches that hit hundreds of thousands of views overnight. Her opponent, a well-funded incumbent who thought the seat was his for life, found himself on the defensive, forced to explain why he'd been absent from half the votes in the last year. Election night was a storm of tension and those volunteers packed into a community center watching the returns flicker across the projector screen. At 10:47 p.m., the final precinct reported. Jasmine had won by just over 2,000 votes. Erupted, but she stood still for a moment, letting the number sink in. She thought about every handshake, every conversation on a porch step, every stranger who told her, "We've been waiting for someone like you." To the podium, the cheers nearly drowned out her first words. "I'm here to be your voice where they'd rather you stay silent," she said, gripping the edges of the lectern as though anchoring herself to the promise. The cameras caught the flash in her eyes, not the glow of victory, but the fire of responsibility. As she walked into the Capitol for the first time, her heels clicking against the marble floor, she glanced up at the dome overhead. The building was beautiful, yes, but it was also full of people who had mastered the art of saying nothing while speaking for hours. She wasn't here to blend in, to disrupt, and in a few short years, that path would lead her to the most dangerous political confrontation of her life, one that might decide whether her promise to her district was kept or broken. As a routine press gaggle on the South Lawn, reporters eyeing in a semicircle, cameras rolling, the late morning sun glinting off the White House windows. Trump strode to the podium with his usual swagger, flanked by Secret Service, the stars and stripes rippling behind him. He was there to announce a public safety emergency and the deployment of federal troops to Washington, D.C. to combat street crime. Between the applause line and the closing remark, his words took a detour. "I'll be in Russia on Friday," he said, pausing as if to let the weight of the statement hang. The reporters glanced at each other. "Russia, Friday." He said it again, slower this time, as if to underline it. "Yes, Russia, Friday." The clip hit social media like an electric shock. On Twitter, #Russia Friday trended alongside #Where is he going? Cable news anchors tried to parse it in real time, scrolling through White House schedules that listed no such trip. On TikTok, creators stitched the clip with Cold War-era spy footage, editing his words over grainy Kremlin shots. Late-night hosts cleared their monologues to make room for the joke. Turned sharper when fact-checkers confirmed the truth. Trump's meeting with Vladimir Putin wasn't in Moscow or even anywhere near Russia. It was scheduled for Anchorage, Alaska. The headlines multiply. President confuses Alaska with Russia, geography error or cognitive slip. By the time the afternoon briefings rolled around, the narrative had shifted from mockery to concern. Caroline Leavitt stepped up to the podium in the Brady briefing room, her expression the definition of composed defiance. "Perhaps one day the president will visit Russia," she said, with a half-smile that read more like a challenge than a joke. But this Friday's meeting with President Putin is, of course, taking place in Alaska. A few reporters smirked. Others leaned forward, waiting for a deeper explanation that never came. She pivoted to crime stats, then ended the briefing early, leaving unanswered questions bouncing like loose change in the press corps. Online, the spin only fueled speculation. Commentators split into two camps. Those calling it a harmless slip from a man with too much on his plate, and those warning it was the latest in a string of unsettling lapses proof, they argue, of a president losing his grip. It wasn't about geography, it was about clarity. And in the coming hearing, she planned to test just how much of it the president still had left to give. Was this just a harmless slip of the tongue or the first crack in the facade of a man who could no longer keep his own story straight? Russia gaffe had barely cooled in the news cycle before murmurs began echoing through the marble corridors of the Capitol. Behind closed doors, Republican aides spoke in hushed tones, their voices dropping lower when they spotted a journalist within earshot. One senior GOP strategist, speaking under condition of anonymity, summed up the mood with surgical bluntness: "We can defend him on policy, defend him on politics, but when we're defending whether he knows where he's going, that's a losing fight." Another, an old campaign hand who had weathered 3 election cycles with Trump, admitted quietly, "Every time he slips, we spend 2 weeks cleaning it up. At some point, the mop stops working." In the hearing room, the tension was no less visible. Jim Jordan sat to Rose's back, shoulders hunched forward, his suit jacket pulling tight across his frame. He leaned in close to a staffer, lips moving quickly, eyes darting toward Trump and then to Jasmine like he was tracking a chess match he couldn't quite predict. Scribbled notes, nodded once, then whispered something back that made Jordan's jaw clench. The man known for his relentless public defense of Trump now looked like he was calculating the cost of every word. Bill brought the room to order. The camera panned briefly over other Republican faces, some neutral, some unreadable, but a few showing that flicker of discomfort politicians try to hide. It was the look of people who had chosen their side years ago, but were beginning to wonder if the ground beneath them was shifting. Every time Jasmine's name trended on social media, every time a late-night host replayed Trump's verbal stumbles, those private doubts grew louder. Hallways after recess, 2 congressional aides passed each other without stopping, one muttering just loud enough to catch, "She's got him cornered." In another office, a Republican communications director pored over overnight polling, her finger tracing the downward slope in suburban approval ratings. She closed the folder and said to no one in particular, "If this keeps up, we're not just defending him, we're sinking with him." Trump adjusted his tie and scanned the room, but the swagger had dulled, replaced by a restless shifting in his seat. He caught Jordan's eye. Jordan gave the smallest nod, not one of encouragement but of acknowledgement to men recognizing that the fight ahead might cost more than either had planned. Jasmine, watching the exchange, tucked the moment away like a weapon for later. It was thick with the unspoken truth: loyalty in politics has a half-life. And as Trump's allies calculated their own survival, the question was no longer if someone would break it, was who would do it first, and whether they would do it before the next crack in the facade became too big to hide. It was dark except for the sliver of light spilling from Jasmine Crockett's office. It was past midnight, but the war room was alive, laptops open, coffee cups scattered, the air humming with the low murmur of strategy. On the far wall, a projector cycled through clip after clip of Trump's gaffes: the Russia-Alaska slip, the Christie Kerr moment, the blank search for Derek Van Orden standing inches away. Every misstep was catalogued, time-stamped, ready to be deployed. Aide Maya tapped her pen against a legal pad. "We need to stack them chronologically, show a pattern he can't talk his way out of." Another aide, Thomas, countered, "No, lead with the most recent. Keep it fresh in people's minds, then pull the thread backward until it unravels everything." Jasmine listened, her elbows resting on the table, eyes fixed on the footage as though she could see beyond it into the man himself, into the moments where confidence cracked and instinct failed. Buzzed, a name flashed on the screen: Ellis, she answered without leaving her seat. Ellis was more than a mentor, he was a survivor of Capitol politics, a man who had faced down giants and lived to tell the tale. "He'll try to bait you into anger," Ellis said without preamble. His voice was low, steady, like the hum of an engine on an empty highway. "Don't take it if you lose your cool," he wins. "Face your words, make him trip over them." Jasmine exhaled slowly, her mind already turning over the advice like a blade in her hand. She stood and walked to the whiteboard, drawing a quick arc: high points, low points, moments of pause. "We control the tempo," she said. "We're not just answering questions, we're telling a story. And in our story, he's the one fumbling for his place in it, Around the table, heads nodded. They weren't just staff tonight, they were co-authors of the next headline. The final hour was spent rehearsing not the answers, but the silences between them. Jasmine practiced letting a question hang just long enough to make Trump fill the void, knowing he couldn't resist. They drilled her on pivots, on cutting off Caroline Leavitt without raising her voice, on landing each point like a nail driven clean through wood. By the time the clock on the wall edged past 2 a.m., the plan was set. Closed her laptop and looked out the narrow window toward the Capitol dome, glowing faintly against the night sky. "Tomorrow isn't about me versus him," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It's about the truth versus the story he's been selling. And I intend to bankrupt that story." She turned back to the team, her voice sharper now. "Get some rest, we're going to make history in the morning." The streets were silent. Inside, every detail of tomorrow's confrontation was locked in place. The only question left was whether she could keep her composure, and the insults came swinging like knives, and whether he'd realized late that she'd been sharpening hers all along. Cracked once, and the hearing roared back to life. Cameras refocused, pens hovered, the air charged like static before lightning. Jasmine leaned in, voice crisp enough to slice through the murmurs. "Mr. President, let's start with July 31st. In front of veterans, you asked, 'Where's Derek?' While Representative Van Orden was standing 6 inches from you." That, Trump opened his mouth. She didn't wait. 2 weeks before that, you introduced your Homeland Security Secretary as Christy Kerr, a retired golfer. Do you remember that? He shifted in his seat, lips parting again, but she pressed forward, the rhythm quickening. "And just last Monday, in front of national press, you told America you'd be in Russia on Friday when your own schedule said Alaska. Twice, back to back, still ringing a bell." He raised his hand slightly, the familiar signal that he was about to hijack the moment. "You know, this is the kind of... This isn't your rally," Jasmine cut in, her tone steel over ice. "It's the truth's turn." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Even the stenographer glanced up. Trump's jaw worked like he'd just bitten into something sour. "Again, if you want to talk about mistakes, Congresswoman, we are talking about mistakes," she said, leaning forward until her voice seemed to bridge the space between them. "Yours, on the record, under oath," she kept going, her delivery relentless but controlled, like a prosecutor closing in on a cornered witness. She listed was punctuated by a pause just long enough for the cameras to catch his reaction, the tightening grip on the microphone, the flicker in his eyes when he couldn't swat the point away. Leavitt shifted, uncomfortably beside him, flipping through her binder as though she could find a page that explained this away. Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't need to. This wasn't about the spin anymore. This was about planting in the public's mind a pattern too stark to ignore. "It's not one slip," Jasmine continued, her voice gathering momentum. "It's a string." Lead straight to the question every American watching wants answered. Is the man sitting here today fully capable of leading this country? Trump tried to speak over her again, louder this time. "I'm more capable than you'll ever be." Capable leaders don't forget where they're going, who they're talking to, or the names of the people they hire, she said, her voice cutting through his like glass through cloth. "Words. They don't ask their staff to patch the holes." For a long beat, the only sound was the faint whir of the cameras. Trump's glare locked on her, but she didn't flinch. She let the silence hang, heavy and deliberate, forcing the room to sit with the weight of what had just been laid bare. How do you win against someone who rewrites reality? You don't give them time to pick up the pen. Didn't let the silence cool. She shifted her gaze from Trump to the young woman seated beside him. "Ms. Leavitt," she began, her voice low but cutting, "you're 27 years old and rewriting history for a man who forgets his own words." Caroline's head snapped up, lips parting as if to respond, but the sharp flush creeping up her neck betrayed her before she spoke. The press gallery leaned in. Every photographer knew this was the shot. Pressed on, giving her no time to regroup. "You stood at that podium last week and told the American people, maybe one day he'll visit Russia, as if confusing Alaska for Moscow is just a charming quirk. You expect the public to believe that was strategy, not damage control. Tell me, Ms. Leavitt, how many hours a week do you spend cleaning up after his mistakes?" Hung there, heavy, drawing a ripple of murmurs from the crowd. Caroline glanced down at her notes, fingers tightening on the pages, searching for a safe sentence that wasn't there. "I the president," she stammered, voice faltering under the weight of the room. Head whipped toward Jasmine. "You don't talk to her like that. She's the best press secretary this country's ever had." The tone was sharper now, defensive in a way that revealed more than it protected. Jasmine didn't look at him, she kept her eyes locked on Caroline. "The best press secretary for whom, Mr. President? The American people, or just you?" Jaw tightened, but she kept going. "You've put a young woman in the impossible position of turning your missteps into talking points, of pretending the truth is a typo. You call that loyalty. I call it exploitation." Caroline's eyes flicked briefly to Trump, as if to ask whether she should fight back, but his glare was aimed squarely at Jasmine now, his voice low and dangerous. "Careful, Congresswoman," Jasmine repeated, leaning forward, "is what your staff has been for years, careful to cover for you, careful to keep the public from seeing the cracks, careful to defend the indefensible. And look where it's gotten us, a nation wondering if its president even remembers where he's going next week." It was electric. No one dared shift in their seats. Caroline sat frozen, her pen hovering uselessly over a blank legal pad. Trump's hand was gripping the microphone stand so hard his knuckles had gone pale. Jasmine let her words settle, then sat back, her voice dropping to something almost soft. "The truth doesn't need a shield, Mr. President, but you do. And the question is how long before the shield shatters." Held still, thick with the sense that something irreversible had just been said. And somewhere deep in the silence, the sound of armor cracking was almost audible. The words were still hanging in the Senate chamber when they detonated online. C-SPAN's live feed clipped the exchange into a 30-second segment before the hearing had even adjourned, and within minutes, it was everywhere. #Shield shatters and #Truths term were climbing the trending list alongside #Crockett vs Trump. TikTok users wasted no time. One clip overlaid Jasmine's "This isn't your rally, it's the truth's turn" with a boxing bell sound effect, freezing on Trump's reaction like a knockout replay. Another layered dramatic orchestral music over her final line to Caroline, ending with the caption, "The moment the shield cracked." Fresh brought a new wave of takes. Progressive activists hailed her as a truth warrior, posting side-by-side stills of her leaning in versus Trump recalling, "This is how you hold power accountable," read one viral tweet with 1.2 million likes. Memes flooded Instagram. Trump in a boxing ring with Jasmine as the referee counting him out, Caroline holding a game over sign in black and white. Side of the digital battlefield was just as loud. Conservative pundits labeled her disrespectful, grandstanding, and a disgrace to the chamber. On Fox News, a primetime host replayed the clip with the chyron, Congresswoman Crockett's public meltdown. Hashtags like #CrockettOut and #Respect the Office began to appear, pushed by accounts with MAGA banners in their bios. Hardening, each camp seeing in the same 30 seconds either an act of courage or an act of arrogance. Influencers jumped in. One political YouTuber cut the footage into a 15-minute analysis, breaking down body language, pausing to zoom on Trump's grip tightening on the mic stand. Another dissected Caroline's split-second glance toward Trump, calling it the look of someone realizing the room just turned against her. Afternoon. The clip had been viewed over 20 million times across platforms. Cable news couldn't get enough. MSNBC ran it in slow motion with analysts praising Jasmine's precision. While Newsmax looped it with commentary about Democratic theatrics, the soundbite had legs, and it was running at full sprint into every corner of the American conversation. In her office, Jasmine's aides watched the metrics spike on the dashboard, a jagged mountain of engagement. Maya grinned, shaking her head. "They'll try to spin it, but they can't unsee it." Jasmine didn't smile. She knew virality could be a double-edged blade. The same wave lifting her could just as easily turn against her if she stumbled next. Still, she allowed herself one thought. The message had landed. Beneath the roar of likes and headlines, a quieter question began to take shape, one that no algorithm could answer. Would this moment galvanize the country around her, or fracture it further into warring camps that no truth could cross? After the clip went viral, the first thing Jasmine saw when she stepped into her office wasn't her desk, it was the stack. Envelopes, thick and thin, crammed into mail bins that lined the hallway like barricades. Her aide, Thomas was already sorting them into two piles, one marked with a bright green sticker, the other with red. "Green for love," he said without looking up. "Red for hate." The green pile was taller but the red was heavier. One from the red stack at random. No return address. The handwriting was blocky, angry. "You're a disgrace to this country. Watch your back." Another. "If you were a real patriot, you'd resign. If you were smart, you'd keep your mouth shut." Some were uglier, dripping with slurs she'd heard before but never in such concentrated venom. Each word was meant to wound. Pile was a different kind of weight. Letters from strangers who felt like neighbors. A retired schoolteacher from Ohio who wrote, "I've been voting since Kennedy, and I've never been prouder of someone in that chamber." A single mother from Arizona, "My son saw your clip and asked me if all leaders tell the truth like that. I told him, not all, but some." She does. With children's drawings, crayon portraits of her at the microphone, speech bubbles filled with phrases it didn't quite spell right but understood perfectly. The phone rang every hour, sometimes every half hour. Pastors from black churches in Georgia, tribal council leaders from the Dakotas, community organizers from Texas barrios. They all said some version of the same thing. "Keep going, we've got your back." This carried the weight of generations who had been told to wait their turn and learned the hard way that turns were never freely given. The praise was fuel, but the threats were fire. Security briefings became part of her daily schedule. The Capitol Police detail was expanded. She caught herself scanning the street from her car window, watching for the wrong kind of attention. Here exactly it was the constant hum of vigilance, the knowledge that visibility came with a price, and that the invoice had already arrived. One letter stuck with her more than the rest. It came from a man in Mississippi, handwritten on lined paper. "I never thought I'd agree with a Democrat," it read. "But my father's memory is slipping, and I see in him what I saw in that hearing. To say what you did. Don't let them shut you up." Jasmine held it for a long moment, staring at the uneven handwriting. It reminded her of her own father's notes when he was teaching her how to balance a checkbook firm in intention and steady in execution. She tucked it into her jacket pocket, close enough to feel over her heart. Turns personal. Does the fire burn hotter or fade? Jasmine already knew her answer. The match had been struck, and she wasn't about to let anyone put it out. While Jasmine's office buzzed with letters and calls of support, across town, the White House map room was locked down. The blinds were drawn, cell phones collected in a black case by the door. At the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by a tight knot of advisors, campaign operatives, and comm strategists. The big screen on the wall froze on a still from the hearing. Jasmine leaning forward, eyes locked on him, lips caught mid-sentence. Trump jabbed a finger at it. "I want her buried." Headlines, rumors, whatever you've got. Make her regret opening her mouth. Slid a thin folder across the table. Inside, opposition research. Old tweets, out-of-context quotes, grainy photos from a law school protest. Most of it was nothing, but in the right hands, spun the right way, it could become something ugly. "We can push this through friendly outlets," Diade said. "She'd be answering questions about her own credibility instead of yours." Advisor suggested a whisper campaign, anonymous tips to conservative bloggers hinting at ethical concerns from her early career. Trump leaned back, smirking. "Good. Make it stick. The moment she defends herself, she's on my turf." Night, in a cramped conference room 2 floors below Jasmine's office, her inner circle gathered. The mood was tense, lit by the glow of laptops and the low hiss of the coffee machine. Thomas read aloud from his phone. 2 outlets are already running with the protest photo. They're calling it evidence of radical ties. Maya shook her head, pacing. "It's garbage, but it's sticky. Once it's out there, people remember the accusation, not the truth." Flair, one faction wanted to go on the offensive, hit back hard, dig into Trump's own controversies, flood the media with counter-scandals. The other urged restraint, stay on policy, keep the moral high ground, don't get sucked into the mud. "If we take the bait, we make it about her," Maya argued, and that's exactly what they want. But Thomas countered, "If we stay quiet, the narrative calcifies. By the time we correct it, the damage is done." Sat at the head of the table, listening, fingers steepled under her chin. She knew both sides were right in their own way. Politics wasn't just a battle of facts, it was a battle of frames, and frames could be shattered or reinforced depending on what you did next. She also knew the stakes were higher now. This wasn't a skirmish over words in a hearing. This was an open attempt to redefine her in the public eye before she could define herself. Silent when she finally spoke. They want me off balance. They want me playing defense. That's how they win. Her eyes swept the table, sharp and unblinking. So the question isn't whether we hit back or stay quiet, it's whether we can make them regret ever coming after us in the first place. Punch back or rise above, or will she find a way to do both, and turn their attack into the very thing that destroys them? The war room was empty now, the argument still hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Jasmine sat alone at her desk, the glow from her laptop the only light in the room. Outside her window, the Capitol dome loomed, washed in gold, a monument to both triumph and betrayal. Past another news headline twisting her words, another flood of anonymous vitriol in her inbox. It was almost easier to ignore the insults. What cut deeper were the threats, the ones that hinted at her family. Her mind went uninvited to her parents' modest house, the quiet street they lived on. Would someone show up there? Was the fight worth the risk? Back, closing her eyes for just a moment, but the questions wouldn't stop. What if they buried her under enough lies that even the truth couldn't dig her out? What if the voters who had believed in her started to doubt? The quiet was suffocating, pressing against her ribs. She was supposed to be unshakable in public, but here, alone, she could admit it. She was tired. Drifted to the bookshelf, to a single black and white frame perched on the edge. It was her grandmother, decades younger, walking in a civil rights march. The woman's eyes in that photo were fearless, her posture defiant, even as police loomed in the background. Jasmine remembered the stories how her grandmother had been shoved, cursed at, threatened, but never stepped out of line. "Why are you out of showing up?" she'd once told Jasmine. "They win twice, once on the street, and once in your heart." Jasmine stood and took the photo in her hands, running her thumb along the edge of the glass. The world her grandmother had fought for wasn't finished. The faces had changed, the tactics had evolved, but the battle was still the same: truth against convenience, dignity against power. She was in a position her grandmother could only have dreamed of, inside the very halls where those fights could be won or lost. She returned to her desk, the weight in her chest shifting from doubt to something harder, denser. The headlines, the threats, the spin, they were the price of doing something that mattered. And if her name was going to be in their mouths, it would be because she refused to fold. Her pen, crossing out half her planned opening statement for tomorrow, replacing it with sharper lines, points that would land harder and faster. The office was still silent, but she felt the nose building again, not outside, but inside her, the drumbeat of resolve returning. She set the photo of her grandmother beside her notes, a quiet witness to what came next. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just show up. Did she want her name attached to? The kind that survives the day and shapes the years that follow. Of the Capitol felt different that morning, charged, claustrophobic, alive with the hum of anticipation. Security lines stretched longer than usual, staffers whispering to each other as though they were in on some unscripted history. The hearing room was already packed 20 minutes before start time. The air was filled, every inch of the press gallery claimed by reporters and camera operators jockeying for the best angle. The air was hot with the sharp smell of coffee and perfume, the kind of heat that builds not from temperature but from proximity to something volatile. Sat at the witness table, posture straight, hands folded loosely in front of her. She wore a dark suit, the cut sharp enough to slice through the room's nose. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes scanned everything: the shifting of aides at the far end, the murmurs from the gallery, the subtle rearrangement of camera tripods to keep her perfectly in frame. This was her battlefield, and she'd arrived before the first shot was fired. The side of the room opened, and the cameras pivoted like gun turrets. Trump stepped in, 15 minutes late, his jaw set, his walk slower than usual. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he dropped into his seat with a grunt that carried to the second row. The irritation radiated off him in waves. Even Caroline Leavitt, trailing close behind, kept her gaze fixed on her notes rather than his face. Came alive, the mechanical chatter of shutters layering over the low rustle of bodies leaning forward. He glanced toward Jasmine, just long enough to register that she was already watching him. She didn't flinch or nod. She simply met his eyes for one heartbeat longer than was comfortable, then returned her gaze to the papers in front of her. That was the first move. He'd expected her to acknowledge his entrance. The chair shuffled papers, the sound unnaturally loud in the thick silence. Outside the chamber, more cameras were lined up along the hallway, their operators ready to catch every exit and every offhand remark. Social media feeds were already buzzing hashtags in both their names trending before a single word had been spoken. Police officer stepped closer to the dais, his hand resting on the radio at his shoulder. Not because there was a threat, but because the atmosphere was that top one verbal spark and the whole room could combust. And Nate handed Trump a fresh folder. He didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back, eyes narrowing, as if daring Jasmine to make the first mistake. The gavel was still in his hand, posed. The cameras zoomed, focusing on the exact moment when sound would break the stillness. This wasn't just another day in the Senate. It was the collision point of weeks of escalating tension, a contest between composure and provocation. And when the gavel finally fell, the only question that mattered was simple, sharp, and loaded. Who would control the narrative today and who would be forced to live with it tomorrow? His echo had barely faded when Trump leaned forward, his voice pitched low but laced with denim. "You," he said, jabbing a finger toward Jasmine, "are the most disrespectful member of Congress I ever had the misfortune of dealing with." The insult hit the air like a slap, drawing a collective inhale from the gallery. Some maids glanced at each other, uncertain whether to write it down or pretend it hadn't happened. Didn't blink. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the words to hang between them, then tilted her head slightly, as if she were considering whether to even bother responding. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm for the weight of what she was about to drop. "Dead or disrespectful to you," she said evenly, "then dishonest to America." Rippled through the crowd, the kind of low, electric reaction that signaled the cameras had just caught something that would live on in 1,000 political ads. Trump shifted in his seat, clearly preparing a counterpunch, but Jasmine pressed forward. "Mr. President, I've seen what happens when leaders expect blind loyalty at the expense of truth. It rots institutions from the inside out. I don't get to demand my respect while you erode the trust of the people who sent me here." Her words came measured, each one placed like a brick in a wall he couldn't climb over. Caroline Leavitt's voice cut in from Trump's right, tight and high with urgency. "Congresswoman, the president has answered your questions." Jasmine turned toward her, not sharply, but with a deliberate pivot that shifted the entire focus of the room. "I understand you've made a career out of defending his every word. But let me be clear, history won't remember the staffers who polished the lies. It will remember the leaders who told the truth when it was hardest." Caroline's lips pressed together, the color in her cheeks deepening. The chair creaked as he leaned in, eyes locked on Jasmine. "You think you're going to make a name for yourself off me?" "Think again." She met his gaze without flinching. "Oh, I'm not trying to make a name for myself," she said, her voice dropping to a razor-edged whisper the microphone still caught. "I'm making sure yours goes down in the right chapter." Held still, as if even the air had stopped moving. Every camera was trained on them, no one daring to cough or shuffle papers. Outside, the hashtags were already being typed, the clips already queued for upload. Inside, the battle lines had never been clearer. Deep beneath the marble and mahogany, the question began to pulse like a drumbeat. Was this the moment that would define both their careers or the one that would end them? It was a live wire. The aftershock of their exchange still crackled in the air, every set of eyes locked on the space between them, as if something unseen was about to break loose. Trump's jaw worked in tight, deliberate movements, like he was grinding down a response before it escaped. Caroline sat rigid, pen frozen, over her pad, her knuckles bone-white. The chair's gaze darted between them, ready to gavel down at the first sign the confrontation would spill beyond words. Didn't move right away. She let the weight of the silence press in, let the cameras search her face for a flinch they wouldn't find. Her pulse thudded in her ears, but her voice when it finally came was steady enough to slice through the static. "Mr. President," she said, each syllable measured, deliberate. America deserves a president who remembers his people before he forgets himself. His people before he forgets himself. The sentence landed with the force of a hammer on steel. For a moment, no one breathed. Trump's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. Even he seemed to recognize that anything he said now would echo against that line like an afterthought. In the gallery, a reporter stood and hovered over paper, as if unsure whether to write or just underline the moment in thick black ink. His gaze swept the room, locking briefly with the faces that mattered, veterans of battles like this, journalists who knew history, and they saw it, even a few colleagues across the aisle who, for a fleeting second, dropped their guarded expressions. She didn't wait for permission to continue. This job isn't about the man in the chair. It's about the millions who aren't in this room but live with the consequences of what happens here. They deserve clarity, they deserve truth, and they deserve a leader who can carry both without stumbling over his own shadow. Trump's fingers drummed once against the table, but the sound was small, almost swallowed by the quiet. The camera zoomed closer, the red recording lights glowing like watchful eyes. Somewhere in the back, a flashbulb popped, punctuating the moment with a sharp, metallic click. She gathered her notes slowly, not breaking eye contact with him, until the very last page was aligned. She stood not hurried, not hesitant, and the microphones caught the faint rustle of her jacket as she turned toward the exit. The chair said something procedural, but it was drowned beneath the low ripple of voices that followed her path. Aides who had been glued to their phones now watched her go, the sound of her heels against the marble floor echoing in the space she left behind. No one could say what the lasting headline would be. Maybe it would be the clash, maybe the insults, maybe the viral clips. Maybe it would be that one sentence, replayed again and again, until it was no longer about the politics of the moment, but about the standard it demanded. And as the door closed behind her, the question hung in the air like the last note of a song no one wanted to end. Would history remember this day for her, or for him? The sentence had already become a headline. America deserves a president who remembers his people ran across the CN and Chiron in bold red, looping endlessly beneath the clip of Jasmine delivering it with surgical precision. MSNBC's panel called it a line for the history books, while Fox News dubbed it cheap theater from an attention-hungry congresswoman. Morning's papers were unanimous in one thing: placement. Jasmine's face was everywhere. The Washington Post, the New York Times, even the Wall Street Journal ran stills from the hearing on their front pages. Cable segments dissected every frame. The tilt of her head, the way Trump's eyes narrowed, Caroline Leavitt's frozen smile. Argued over whether it was a masterclass in political courage or a calculated stunt, but the one thing no one argued about was this: she had seized the moment. By the third day, the numbers started moving. A Quinnipiac poll showed a 7-point drop in Trump's strong leadership rating among independents. States, focus groups cited the hearing moment unprompted when asked about the election. The White House attempted to pivot, flooding the news cycle with foreign policy announcements, but the soundbite clung to the headlines like it had teeth. On social media, the split hardened. Others shared the clip with captions like "Finally, someone said it," while her critics clipped it into attack ads warning against disrespect for the presidency. Both sides amplified it until the hearing had become less an event than a cultural fault line, one that people measured themselves against. Operatives whispered about a shift in momentum. If she keeps this up, he's playing on her field, one strategist admitted off the record. Another, grim-faced, said simply, "This is the kind of moment that can swing an election." The coverage was both a weapon and a weight. She had put the truth in the center of the national conversation, but now it was her job to keep it there without letting it consume her. And somewhere between the pundit debates and the polling charts, a question was beginning to take shape, not just in the Capitol, but across the country. Was this the turning point in the race for truth, or just the opening volley in a war neither side could afford to lose? The headlines were still running when Jasmine finally stepped inside her apartment, closing the door against the constant hum of the city. The quiet felt foreign after a week of microphones and cameras. On her kitchen table sat a stack of envelopes, forwarded from her congressional office. She paused, tracing the faded ink with her thumb, feeling the connection across miles she'd never traveled. It was weight, but it was pride too, a reminder that her voice carried further than she could see. The next morning, She traded the marble corridors of the Capitol for the worn wooden floors of a community center back in her district. The smell of coffee and floor polish linger in the air as teenagers filled folding chairs, their sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. They weren't here for policy memos, they were here to see if someone in Washington actually remembered where she came from. She spoke without notes, telling them about the curb where she'd watched her father get stopped for nothing, about the case that put her on the political map, about standing toe-to-toe with the president and refusing to blink. But she also told them the part they didn't see: the late nights, the hate mail, the moments she'd wondered if it was worth it. "It's not about being fearless," she said. "It's about showing up even when you're scared. Because someone is always watching, and someone will learn from what you do." When she finished, the room was quiet for a beat before applause broke out, loud and unpolished. She looked at their faces wide-eyed, restless, hungry for a fight that would outlive her. And walking out into the cold afternoon air, she couldn't shake the question pressing at the back of her mind. Who will pick up the torch when she's gone? And will they carry it further than she ever could? The camera found her in a small, dimly lit studio. No audience, no aides, no applause. Just Jasmine Crockett, framed against a black backdrop, her eyes locked on the lens like it was the conscience of the nation itself. She didn't shuffle her notes, she didn't need them. Her voice was steady, but the weight in it was unmistakable. "This fight," she began, her words deliberate, "isn't about left or right, it's about right and wrong. It's about whether we still believe in a country where the truth matters, where the powerful are held accountable, and where no one is too big to answer for their actions." Her tone sharpened. "And I'm here to tell you, if we let lies go unchecked, if we let power go unchallenged, then democracy doesn't fall in one day. It rots slowly, until there's nothing left to save." She leaned in, her hands folded on the table, the faintest shadow crossing her face. "I've looked the most powerful man in this country in the eye and told him the truth. Not because it was safe, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And now, I'm looking at you." Images began to fade in over her voice: voters standing in the rain, civil rights marches from decades past, a mother holding her child outside a polling station. Vote, speak out, protect the fragile thing we call democracy. It doesn't survive on speeches or headlines. It survives on you, on what you're willing to stand for when the moment comes. The shot tightened until her eyes filled the frame. Because one day, it will be your turn to choose. And when that day comes, ask yourself, what will you remember? The comfort of silence or the cost of speaking the truth? The screen cut to black, white letters burned into the darkness. What will you remember when it's your turn to choose? In life, the moments that define us are rarely comfortable. They are the moments we stand up, even when the cost is high. Jasmine's fight wasn't just about politics. It was about defending the truth when it was under attack, and daring to confront power with nothing but courage and conviction. Democracy, justice, and integrity aren't abstract ideas. They live or die by the choices we make every day. When your moment comes, will you speak up for what's right, or stay silent and hope someone else will? Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.